Hi, and welcome to this webinar introducing the new Meta-ethnography Reporting Guidance, what it is and how to use it. I'd like to welcome everybody to this session because there are a lot of people who are actually in the online room from across the UK, but several other countries as well. And there was a lot of interest in people attending this webinar today, but obviously some people couldn't attend because of the timescales, depending on which country they were in. But we do plan to repeat this, or a webinar like this later on in the year, once the guidance is actually launched. I'm Nicola Ring, and I'm a member of the eMERGe project team. And although you can't see them, there's another member of the room with me, member of the team with me in the room, but there's also other members online and in the Collaborate session as well. Anyway, production of the eMERGe Meta-ethnography Reporting Guidance was funded by the National Institute of Health Research, and it was a 2-year project which started at the end of June 2015 and finishes at the end of this month, 2017. So the project is almost, but not quite finished. eMERGe is a collaboration of several UK universities, and the team members and their affiliations are shown here. However, the eMERGe project and the development of the Meta-ethnography, or ME, reporting guidance has been about more than just the project team. We've been really fortunate that throughout the 2 years, and in fact even before, we've been supported by a large project advisory group, or PAG. And the PAG has consisted of a wide range of stakeholders, from academic experts to professional potential end users, and also those representing lay and patient groups. And we've been fortunate that we've had participants in the PAG from across the UK, but also many countries internationally as well. So the academic experts have contributed their specialist knowledge. That might be on the use of meta-ethnography, but it could be that their specialist knowledge is in a related area, like, for example, searching for qualitative evidence to synthesize. And also the academic experts in the PAG have also been networked and connected to other international initiatives in the field of qualitative evidence synthesis as well. So that's been hugely important to us during the eMERGe project. But for us, what's also been important is that we've had a huge range of other potential eMERGe guidance users involved in our PAG. So for example, people who represent organisations that develop clinical guidelines, or health technology assessments, or health policy, and perhaps even more importantly, those representing patient and lay organisations who want to make sure that the views and voices of patients and service users are actually captured and do inform policy and practice. So we wish to acknowledge the support of the PAG throughout the 2 years of our project. It's intended that the eMERGe reporting guidance, the Meta-ethnography reporting guidance, will be simultaneously published later this year. So this webinar is happening ahead of publication, just before the project ends. So we appreciate, I'm sure you'll appreciate, that we can't issue you with hard copies of the final documentation because that's not been published yet. So we can't give you the exact information, exact copies of the information. We can only provide you with some examples because this is an early introduction to the NE reporting guidance. The other thing I should say is that this is not a seminar on meta-ethnography, but it's a very mixed audience that's actually in the room today, and also those who will be listening to this recording after the seminar. So I do need to say a little bit about meta-ethnography just to set the context, because we're aware that some people will be less familiar with this methodology than others. So meta-ethnography is one method for synthesizing qualitative evidence for health policy and practice. There are other approaches, but several reviews have highlighted that meta-ethnography is the approach that's used most often. Meta-ethnography, or ME, was developed in the 1980s by George Noblet and Dwight Hare. And that's a picture of George, who we are delighted to say became an honorary member of the project group, and their seminal Blue Book. Unfortunately, Dwight here passed away some years ago, so as I say, we're really pleased and delighted to have George as an honorary member of our project group. Meta-ethnography is an advanced qualitative methodology, and it's basically bringing together single standalone qualitative research studies that can have a small number of participants and bringing their findings together, synthesizing them to create a stronger weight of evidence to support practice and policy. Meta-ethnography is a process of making the whole into something more than the parts alone imply. So it's going beyond the findings reported in the original studies to create something new. Now, meta-ethnography has been described as being 7 phases, but in practice, these phases overlap. They can run in parallel, and they can go backwards and forwards. So I'm not going into detail about these 7 phases, but I just want to say a little bit about phases 5 and 6 because they're especially important in meta-ethnography reporting. And that is that phase 5 is about systematically comparing the meaning, concepts and themes in the different individual studies, taking into account the different contexts. And it's about identifying common concepts in the individual studies and looking to see whether different studies report or share the same meaning, albeit perhaps expressed in a different terminology or labelled in different formats, but essentially the meaning is shared. And that's reciprocal translation. And it's also about considering whether different concepts in different studies contradict or refute one another, and that is reputational translation. Phase 6 is about determining whether there are common translated concepts from phase 5 that can be compared further with one another to see if some translations or concepts can be synthesized to reach a new overarching interpretation. And if so, they can then go on to develop a new theory, conceptual framework, model. So it's phase 6 that differentiates meta-ethnography from literature review and simple thematic analysis. So why is meta-ethnography reporting guidance needed? It's needed because meta-ethnography was developed in the 1980s for use in educational research, but it's increasingly being used in health research. And in recent years, its use has actually taken off. However, having said that, it's still a young field in comparison to the synthesis of quantitative trial evidence, which is much more established. However, although meta-ethnography is a young field, it's already recognised that too many meta-ethnography reports, for example in journal articles, lack transparency and they're very variable in their quality. And this has several consequences. It's not clear to readers that whether a journal paper labelled meta-ethnography is actually one. So for example, researchers might report a literature review, or they might simply present a summary of the themes from the original studies, and they don't go on to produce a new overarching interpretation or a new theory or a new model. That's not to say they didn't do one, but in their report, they don't articulate how they did phases 5 and 6. It also means that poor meta-ethnography reports are difficult to assess in terms of their quality and the credibility of studies. Now, this is problematic for those experienced or knowledgeable about the field of meta-ethnography, but it's even more problematic for people that are new to the field, whether junior researchers or people like journal editors and journal reviewers that are having to make a decision about whether or not to publish a manuscript reporting a meta-ethnography. But what's really important is that when readers lack confidence in meta-ethnography findings and reports, if they're not certain that what they're reading has come from a high-quality, robustly conducted meta-ethnography, it reduces the potential of these findings to be then utilised and to inform health policy and practice. And this is what makes it really, really important, because meta-ethnography has huge potential to use the views of patients, carers and other service users, and to capture these so they can inform healthcare and clinical decision making. But that can't be done if the findings lack credibility or lack quality, and therefore people can't use them. In recent years, there's been recognition of the need to enhance research reporting generally. And for example, in recent years, there's been reports, research reporting guidance produced, for example, by PRISMA and also from NIHR, but there are others as well. So there is a recognition generally that meta-ethnography reporting guidance needs to be improved. And although there are other reporting guidance that people can use, for example, an NIHR, which is for reporting qualitative evidence synthesis generally, if a meta-ethnography uses NIHR findings or NIHR's guidance, it could still mean that the meta-ethnography report might still lack transparency from the specific perspective of meta-ethnography, because the NIHR is for guidance for qualitative evidence synthesis generally. So how did we develop our eMERGe reporting guidance? Well, this was a 2-year process, but to summarise it in one slide and a few minutes, this is briefly what we did. We first of all reviewed the existing guidance on the conduct and reporting of meta-ethnography. Now, that was a huge volume of information that we read, and it included theoretical texts like the seminal Blue Book, but also other seminal journal papers in the field, so maybe seminal meta-ethnography journal papers. So that review provided a wealth of information on what could be considered to be best practice guidance and recommendations in meta-ethnography conduct and reporting. After we'd identified what could be considered good practice, the recommendations, we then moved into stage 2. And what we did is that we converted the recommended best practice and guidance identified in stage 1, we converted that into draft provisional reporting standards. And that was so we could systematically audit a sample of published meta-ethnographies against these reporting criteria. So basically, when you've got an audit, all that you're doing is that you've got your standards, which outline best practice, and you're comparing best practice with actual practice, which was in the meta-ethnography reports. So really, we just wanted to use the audit reporting standards to enable us to systematically review a sample of published meta-ethnographies to see how they compared with best practice that had come out from stage 1. The audit had 109 standards, so that is a huge amount of standards for any audit. The vast majority of those applied to every study that we audited, but some, like for example quality appraisal, were optional. The audit standards also reflected the 7 phases of meta-ethnography. Now, it's only the research team that used the audit standards. So the audit standards had a clear specific role in stage 2. After the audit, we then moved to stage 3, and we tested the meta-ethnography reporting best practice by taking it to potential users in an online Delphi. And so to do that, we converted the audit standards into a format suitable for use within the online Delphi. And we were also conscious that the Delphi included a wide range of stakeholders, some who had an expertise in meta-ethnography and many that didn't, but were likely to use the findings perhaps in guideline development or perhaps because they represented a patient group. So in the Delphi, we tested best practice in the preliminary reporting items. And so we took, so in stage 3, we converted the audit standards, of which remember we had 109, and we converted these into 59 reporting items that we then took out to the potential users in our online Delphi. Now, the reason that we were able to reduce the reporting items down to a more manageable 59 was that we moved away from using the meta-ethnography phases for the Delphi. Instead, we used journal subject headings like introduction, methods, findings, and discussion. And we thought that that would fit better with our participants who were representing a wide range of stakeholders. But the advantage of moving to using journal headings for the Delphi was that because meta-ethnography is an iterative process, and because the phases often overlap, that what we found in the audit was that many of the audit standards often duplicated or were very similar between the different phases. So in stage 3, we were testing the preliminary good practice guidance amongst potential users in an online Delphi. And we took the preliminary reporting items to 62 Delphi participants who voted over the reporting, or who voted on the reporting criteria over 3 rounds to determine consensus of which reporting items should then be transferred into the final reporting guidance. In stage 4, after the Delphi, with input from the project advisory group, we had to then turn the reporting items that were used just in the Delphi, we had to convert them into our final reporting criteria. And this was a very complex and iterative process. We had to ensure that the final reporting criteria were in a format that would be usable to a wide range of potential end users. And we also had to be conscious of the potential people who the needs of the people who would potentially be using the reporting guidance. We also needed to make sure that the reporting criteria and guidance at the end were seen as being, as I say, usable and in a format that would help end users. So the final reporting guidance, we have retained an emphasis on being meta-ethnography specific. The final reporting guidance have moved back to a format that reflects the 7 phases of meta-ethnography. Because again, based on feedback that came from the Delphi and from feedback from our project advisory group, it was felt that that was necessary because otherwise it wouldn't help enhance transparency round about phases 5 and 6 in particular. So just a quick summary there then. So we reviewed the existing good practice guidance, we created audit standards, which we then used to audit a sample of meta-ethnographies to compare actual reporting practice against good practice in the standards. We then tested the preliminary reporting items in our online Delphi, which had 62 participants over 3 rounds. And then after the Delphi, we then went through quite a long, lengthy, stressful, time-consuming and laborious process to convert the reporting items into the final reporting criteria.
I was just wondering, were there any particular meta-ethnography papers that, as you were going through, were kind of like the gold standard that you could kind of advise us to also have a look at?
Well, certainly there are key seminal texts in this field and journal papers in the field that we can recommend people look at. And certainly that's going to be, we cite them. I'm going to talk a bit more about them later on actually, but certainly in the report, in the report and also the journal paper when it appears later on in the year, we will identify some examples then. What we found is that sometimes some papers were very good at reporting maybe a particular phase or phases, and then maybe were less good sometimes in reporting other phases in meta-ethnography. So sometimes what you find is that some papers have particular reporting strengths, and so they might be best practice for certain phases, but maybe less helpful in later phases. So that's maybe a roundabout answer, But what I would say is when the reporting guidance comes out later in the year in journal publications, there will be references and links made to where we think there are examples of good practice. Who is the meta-ethnography reporting guidance for? A range of users, clearly researchers who are conducting or planning to conduct meta-ethnography, whether they're doing it as an individual standalone synthesis or they're doing a meta-ethnography perhaps alongside a systematic review of trials. They're also going to be relevant clearly to PhD students and their supervisors, and we know certainly from people attending this webinar today that that's a key audience, a key target group. But we also know that the guidance is going to be relevant to those who are likely to use the findings of meta-ethnography to inform decision-making in practice. So for example, those who are developing clinical guidelines, health technology assessments, or health policy, those who need to be able to make some assessment about the transparency of the reporting of the meta-ethnography, so they can make an informed judgment about whether or not to incorporate the findings from that ME into their guideline or health technology assessment. Another key group is going to be journal editors and reviewers, because they are clearly going to have to know what constitutes good reporting in meta-ethnography when they're deciding to publish a paper reporting these findings. But another very important group for us is those representing patient groups and lay organisations, groups that will want to ensure that their own policy, their strategic documents, whatever, reflects the views of patients and service users. So what's important is that the meta-ethnography reporting guidance is potentially relevant to a wide range of people. It should not just be seen as being an academic tool. I want to look now at the meta-ethnography reporting guidance, and you'll understand that because this is an ahead of publication webinar, that we can't give you the specific guidance just now. We can't issue you with copies until it's published later in the year, but we will just give you an overview and give you an idea about the format and content. The eMERGe reporting guidance consists of 3 parts. There's part 1, which is the guidance table, which is really a summary of the reporting criteria. There's part 2, which is the explanatory notes, which provides additional supporting information, and also which relates to the question earlier from Ria. It gives you some appropriate underpinning references. And then also part 3, extensions to reporting criteria. And these refer to aspects that may or may not apply to a meta-ethnography report, depending on the context of the study. So the reporting criteria are not intended to be a simple checklist. So it's important that users are aware of and refer to the full 3 parts of the guidance. I'm going to say more shortly about parts 2 and parts 3, but I want to start by looking at part 1 first. Part 1 is a guidance table, and this is really a summary of the reporting criteria only. It's been deliberately designed to be 1 page, as we thought that would be helpful for users to have like an at-a-glance summary. There are in total 19 reporting criteria in the guidance table, and these reporting criteria are common to all meta-ethnography reports. Now, we're not saying the reporting criteria are mandatory, but they are evidence-based, and therefore we would advise or recommend their use. The meta-ethnography reporting guidance also reflect the 7 phases of meta-ethnography. Now, we know that meta-ethnography is an iterative process, so we're not saying that you have to apply meta-ethnography in a linear approach. We're not advocating that at all. But by using the 7 phases of meta-ethnography as our structure for the guidance table, it allows us to indicate where we think a particular reporting criteria may best fit with a particular phase. So we're not saying that a particular reporting criteria must always be reported at a particular phase, but we appreciate that there might be times that a particular meta-ethnography report, they might provide some information maybe in a different phase than where we've indicated it might sit. That does not matter, but what does matter is that the 19 reporting criteria that feature in the guidance table, that information is provided in a report, because this is the information that's needed to make a meta-ethnography report transparent and helps readers. The guidance table is methodologically specific. It does, as I say, focus around the 7 meta-ethnography phases. We did consider at one point using the or creating the guidance table around the format or structure of journal and report section headings. So we did consider structuring the guidance tables according to what you'd expect in the introduction and the methods and the findings section of a report. But we realized, and based on feedback from others, that that format would be too generic and it wouldn't reflect the information that people need to provide to make a meta-ethnography report transparent, which is that particularly we needed information that ensured that reporting of phases 5 and 6 was more comprehensive than it is currently at the moment. However, we recognized and were aware that some people, like for example journal reviewers, may not be experts in meta-ethnography, but they may still be using the eMERGE reporting guidance. So for some users like that, we appreciate that they would like to understand which part of a meta-ethnography report that a particular reporting item could appear under. So what we've done is we've linked the reporting criteria to where we think that information might sit in a journal paper or a report in terms of the section headings. Now, what I'll do is I'm going to show you an example from the guidance table just now, and I'll explain that, and then I'll ask if there's any points of clarification. This is an example of 2 of the reporting criteria from phase 1 of the guidance table. Each of the reporting criteria are numbered, so these 2 are the first 2 in the guidance table. So these are the first 2 of 4 in phase 1. The criteria heading refers readers to which meta-ethnography phase it relates to. So you can see that this example is from phase 1. And one thing I should say at this point is that we've modified the name of the original phase 1 as it appears in the Blue Book. In the Blue Book, phase 1 is simply getting started, but we've refined it to specifically say now selecting meta-ethnography and getting started. And that's simply because we know from the work that we have done that often meta-ethnography reports, people don't say why they specifically chose meta-ethnography over other methods of qualitative evidence synthesis. So that when that information is missing, readers of a meta-ethnography report often find it then hard to understand whether a review aims and questions are actually congruent with the meta-ethnography approach. Yeah, I can see a point of clarification from Ruth Jepson, which yes, the Blue Book, I mean the original Blue Book by Noblet and Hare. So you can see that in this example I've given you here, the first 2 reporting criteria are about the rationale, the context, and the aims of the meta-ethnography. And we believe that that's best suited to appear in the introduction section of a journal paper or a journal report. So phase 1, the reporting criteria, as they are relatively straightforward to understand, but they may be less so in other phases of the process. And so people using the eMERGE reporting guidance will need more information in terms of understanding what they should report. So I'm now going to go on and give another example, but to refer now to the explanatory notes and their purpose. This example is from phase 5 of the meta-ethnography reporting guidance, translating studies into one another. and that we know that phase 5 is one of the areas of meta-ethnography reports that is lacking in transparency. There are only 2 reporting criteria in phase 5, and this is both of them here, and both relate to the process and the outcomes of translation. And we would expect that details for the reporting of criteria 13 would appear in the methods section of a report or journal paper, and that the information for reporting criteria 14 would appear in the findings section of a journal paper and report. Now, if you look at these reporting criteria, if you look specifically at criterion 13, you will see that what meta-ethnographers are asked to report is only briefly stated in the guidance table. For example, it just says, describe how you preserve the context and meaning between concepts. Describe how translation was conducted, reciprocal and refutational. And describe alternative interpretations or explanations, how these were considered. So what we would say is that the reporting criteria in the guidance table indicate that the reporting of a specific issue is really important, but you can see from this example, it doesn't actually really tell you how you go about doing that. It doesn't give you more information. So it gives you the sort of highlighted points, or this is the information that we would like you to provide at this point, but I say that it doesn't actually give too much details. So at this point, that's when users of the eMERGe reporting guidance would then look at the extensions in part two of the reporting guidance. The explanatory notes provide additional information that give details of how you would apply the reporting criterion. Each criterion, each of the 19 criteria in the guidance table has an explanatory note. And so for each one, you'll find there's details of the type of information that would be helpful to provide at that point to improve transparency of reporting. And, as we also mentioned earlier, it provides supporting references. So I say what we found when we did the stage 1 review of good practice and the audit is that sometimes some meta-ethnography reports are excellent examples of maybe reporting in phases 1 to 4 or 1 to 5, but are maybe less good at reporting in phases 5 and 6. Or sometimes some reports are maybe less good at the earlier phases, but are excellent examples of how to report translation. So the explanatory notes give people further information about the supporting references that are good practice examples that we think are helpful. Staying with the example from the reporting guidance I've just given you, phase 5, reporting criterion 13, the explanatory notes then give you information about the type of narrative that could be provided, which would help you indicate how the context was preserved during translation. So perhaps somebody might report that they related studies by health condition or by a time period, and that they then translated subgroups of papers. The explanatory notes, again, give indication about the types of visual aids that could be used to indicate relationships between concepts. Things like mind maps, grids, tables. The explanatory notes also suggest possible ways of how translation could be conducted, for example, at study level or within studies. And they also provide prompts about how reporters might have considered different ways for alternative interpretations or explanations of how these were considered. So for example, a team of meta-ethnographers may have considered alternative explanations from the perspective of gender or culture or setting of the original participants from the original studies. This is just to illustrate how parts 1 and parts 2 of the guidance come together and complement each other. So part 1 of the guidance table is really the summary. It's the sort of highlighted main points of the information that's required really to maximize the transparency and quality of a meta-ethnography report. But it's high level, very succinct, summarized information. So part 2 is provided the detail and explanatory notes that give us much more indication about the information that's required. I'm going to give a third example from the guidance table, which is phase 7, expressing the synthesis. And there are actually 3 reporting criteria in phase 7, but these are the last 2 in that phase and in the guidance table overall. And we think that both these reporting criteria should appear in the discussion section of a meta-ethnography report. I want to talk more just now on reporting criterion 18, strengths, limitations and reflexivity. Evidence from our audit and other work highlights that very often when meta-ethnographers are reporting the limitations, they reflect on the limitations of the original studies that they included. So they reflect on maybe the small number of participants or the country the study was conducted in. But actually few go on to reflect in a much wider way and how they, in particular, how they conducted their meta-ethnography and how that might have influenced their interpretation. So, as I say, there's evidence that suggests that actually meta-ethnography reports are not very good at reflecting on how the research processes of the meta-ethnography itself, how it was conducted, may have limited the final interpretation. So, in the explanatory notes, there's much more additional information saying about how reporting criterion 18 could be applied. And in particular, the explanatory notes ask that meta-ethnographers reflect on context of their study, but at 2 levels. That they reflect on the internal context, firstly, in terms of how they included studies, those studies that were synthesized, their limitations. And as I say, we know that that's generally well done. But we also want people reporting meta-ethnography to report as well on the internal context of their study, but from their perspective, from their processes. So for example, if they were an all-female team of social scientists working in, say, the UK, we want them to consider how that might have then influenced their final interpretation, because you might expect there might be differences in their perspectives when compared with a male team of researchers, say from America and from a different academic discipline. So the explanatory notes prompts those reporting meta-ethnography to reflect on the internal context from these 2 perspectives, but also to consider the external context of their meta-ethnography. So to compare the output of their synthesis in the context of the existing literature. So for example, did they actually provide a novel insight, perhaps because it provided a different cultural perspective, or because the work was done from a different temporal context. Another reason that I wanted to focus on phase 7 at this point is not just to give you another example of explanatory notes, but also because this is to make the link to about why people might then need to refer to the extensions to the reporting criteria and refer to the extensions to the reporting guidance table. And this is part 3, and I want to talk a little bit more about these just now. Part 3 of the Meta-ethnography Reporting Guidance is extensions. And these items are reporting issues that may or may not apply to a meta-ethnography report, depending on the context of that study. So, for example, perhaps a meta-ethnography is being conducted alongside a systematic review of trials, or perhaps there might be an expectation or requirement from a funder that this information is reported. But as I say, this information may or may not apply to reports depending on the context of a study. And because of that, that's why this information, although really important, could not be included within the guidance table, because there's an element of optionality about it. So the 3 reporting criteria extensions are, firstly, there's one about the format of the meta-ethnography output, the report. Now, we know that all meta-ethnographies should have some kind of output, some kind of report. But we're conscious that the format of that report is going to vary quite considerably. And again, that depends on the context in which that meta-ethnography was conducted. So for example, it might depend on the format of a journal and their particular in-house author style. Or it might be, as I say, that maybe the funder of the meta-ethnography might be a patient or lay organisation and they want the information in a particular format that suits them. So because we know the style and nature of a meta-ethnography report varies, again, we couldn't include this information in the main guidance table, but instead we've put it in as an extension. So this includes information on the format of abstracts and the content of abstracts, and also things like the use of the term meta-ethnography in the title and abstract and keywords. The second extension is assessment of the methodological strengths and limitations of included studies. Now, some people might refer to this as quality appraisal. Now, we know this is a debated issue within meta-ethnography. So again, we could not include it in the guidance table because it's not common to all meta-ethnography reports. But many meta-ethnography reports do provide this information because very often it's required by a funder or it may be required by a journal. So again, we had to provide information on this type of reporting for those that needed to provide this information in their meta-ethnography report. But as I say, we could not include it in the main reporting guidance. And the third extension is using grade CIRQUAL to assess confidence in findings from qualitative evidence synthesis. Now again, this may or may not be relevant to meta-ethnographers and their particular report. And again, it depends on the context in which the study is being conducted. So for example, if a meta-ethnography is being conducted or it's hoped that a meta-ethnography, the findings might be incorporated into a guideline or to health technology assessment, then it's important that people using the meta-ethnography reporting guidance refer to this extension for more details on this particular aspect. And that extension provides information on the type of details that we would require in a meta-ethnography report, and also gives references, for example, in the Cochrane Library where you would get more information. What's important to say here then is that the guidance has got the three parts. There's the part one, the guidance table, that's the overview, the summary. Part two for the details really about the type of information that's needed, and part three is extensions that may or may not apply. This is an ahead of publication webinar giving information about the guidance. So where else can you get other information? Well, it's planned that parts 1, 2 and 3 will be simultaneously published later on this year, which is later in 2017, and the provisional title of the paper is shown there. There will also be our report to the funder, which is the National Institute of Health Research, and there will also be other related publications that report different parts of the eMERGe project and its development processes. In addition, there are some training materials. In particular, we've produced 4 short films. Now these are conversation in style, and they feature a junior researcher, Lynn Gilmore, who very kindly is shown on us our journey of wanting to learn more about eMERGE and meta-ethnography and about the reporting guidance. So the 4 films, there's one that features George Noblet, which gives a bit of an overview about meta-ethnography, its origins and contemporary developments. Emma France, who's the principal investigator of the eMERGE project, she gives the background to the project and talks about development. Jane Noyes, who's a member of the eMERGE team, she talks about the eMERGE project and reporting guidance and how it fits with other international initiatives, for example, CIRQUAL. And she also talks about how journal reviewers and editors could use a reporting guidance. And then there's one with myself that talks again a bit more about the reporting guidance and how you use it. So the films have been made, but they're currently in the editing stage and they'll be available later. In fact, we expect them in the next few weeks. And those films and the recording of this webinar will be available later from our eMERGE project site. There is a little bit of time left. So we are happy to take questions. So if you'd like to put your hand up, if you've got a question, then we can go to you, or type in the chat box. Right, one of the questions that's been typed in from Louise is, it's difficult to include lots of detail on methods in journal papers due to word limits. And you're absolutely right, Louise, and that's something that we've experienced ourselves. So what will be suggested, and will be in the paper when it goes for publication, is that we think that a lot of this additional information should appear as supplementary online files to a journal paper. And increasingly you'll see that even with systematic reviews of trial evidence, you'll see that in addition to the journal paper, there's now a lot of additional files that report, say, their PRISMA literature searching, etc. So yes, we are conscious that the journal papers are limited by word count. That's, I think, partly why with the guidance table, that's the key points that we think people should report, but we're aware that they can provide additional information in online, for additional online files. There's now a point that's come in about, does the main report discuss relationships between the new guidance and grade CERQUAL, because journals are starting to expect grade CERQUAL included in meta-ethnography reports. The answer to that is yes, because fortunately through Jane we've had a very clear link to grade CERQUAL, and we've worked hard to make sure that the two complement each other. And yes, and of course it's one of the extensions, because we're conscious that it's really important. I mean, it's difficult trying to give people an overview of something that you don't all have hard copies of. But we wanted to give people an opportunity to hear more while the project's still alive. Right, now that's an interesting point that's come in from Katie, is about, are these items considered minimum standards? Standards are usually a requirement. There's an expectation that standards are met. Now, we did have standards, but they were purely in the audit phase of our development. These are reporting guidance and reporting criteria. So we're not saying that this is compulsory, we're not saying that this has to be done, but what we are saying is that they are evidence-based, and that certainly we would see them as minimum core, common reporting items that we would expect to see if people want to ensure that their meta-ethnography report is as transparent as possible to readers, and can therefore hopefully be translated through into policy and practice. How to conduct meta-ethnography and discussion groups for people doing meta-ethnography. Not today. We ourselves have learned a lot about how to conduct meta-ethnographies, although that wasn't our primary purpose. This is primarily about reporting, because currently, as I say, we know reporting is really poor, and that is impacting on the potential barriers to getting these findings then used in practice. But what we would say is, in terms of the conduct, I think the reporting does give some indication. It's good practice in terms of reporting, but if you look at the reporting guidance, it does then give you some suggestions about what good conduct could be too. In that, for example, we know that refutational translation is poorly done at the moment. Very few studies do that, and actually we would say that that's really important, and that there should be a greater emphasis on that than before. And we also know that the context and understanding the context of the individual studies is also really, really important. So I think when the guidance comes out, it will help, and it will give people pointers towards conduct, although that wasn't our primary focus. Emma France, are you in the room? Does anybody else want to answer that from the eMERGE team?
Well, there'll also be other publications coming out of the project. It won't be immediate, of course, so those also will help provide some guidance in conducting meta-ethnography, because obviously our understanding of the approach has really developed over the course of 2 years, and we've been working alongside Professor George Noblet, and the way he thinks about meta-ethnography has changed too. So it has moved on a bit since he wrote his book in 1988. So there will be some guidance in the actual reporting guidance publication, but there'll be other publications too to watch out for. We'll put those on the website as and when they appear.
Thank you, Emma. I mean, yes, our focus was meta-ethnography reporting, but we would admit ourselves that we've learned a huge amount of about how to conduct one now, and I'm certainly keen to do more. But I'm conscious of the time, and before we finish up, what I want to do is to acknowledge these people. The NIHR for funding our project over the last 2 years, Professor George Noblet, honorary member of the eMERGE team. Also our huge project advisory group, both the members and our chair. As I say, we could not have done this project without them. Also the wonderful Steve Bolton, who's helped us with our online support. Lynn Gilmer for filming, and Lonnie Wright, who was our filmmaker extraordinaire. And basically everybody that's helped us along the way. That at the bottom is a picture of the eMERGE team. That's the only one there is of us in the real world altogether, because in the main it's been a virtual project. And also specific thanks to Maggie Cunningham, who joined the project at the end of last year to cover for Emma Francis' maternity leave. And just a reminder to people that, as I say, there's going to be a recording of this webinar, unedited, so, you know, bear that in mind. That will appear on the eMERGE project site after that, and the PDF of the slides, and also to say that's where you'll find the training materials later on, the films. So thank everybody very much. It's been lovely that you've been able to join in with us today, and we wish you all the luck with your own meta-ethnographies, because that's presumably why you've joined us today, and we look forward to reading their final publications in the future. Thanks very much. Bye.